Good day, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar focused on environmental risk evaluation tools, analysis, and loan file documentation. My name is Gary Kulik, and I am delighted to be joined by Daria Milburn today, who will walk you through today's session. We also have with us on the call today CREtelligent's Lucy Mulvey, who heads up our team of environmental professionals. Lucy is a licensed professional geologist, and Daria may call on her to add some color to today's session. Welcome, Lucy. This is the last in a series of 3 webinars focused on environmental risk management, and we hope you're able to join the first 2 sessions. If not, you can view them at a link that will be sent out in an email after today's session. The email will include the presentation material from today's session as well as the previous 2. In today's session, you can submit questions anytime using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we encourage you to submit questions. We'll be addressing some of those throughout the presentation, but we'll probably hold the majority of them for the end of the presentation to make sure we have enough time for Daria to get through all their material. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Daria.
Thanks, Gary. All right, we're going to see if I can do this one in 45 minutes. I think I ran over last time. Sorry, I know there's people who are putting money down on this. We'll do our best. It's really great to have you all back. And like Gary said, we're super happy to have Lucy on as well. So also, if you have any technical questions, Lucy is your girl. So if you want to throw them in the chat, she's here to answer those as well. This is our 3rd webinar, and I'll say that we've spent about 45 minutes on each. And these are all topics that we could easily spend much longer on. Any one of these slides could easily lead to a 3-hour discussion. So if you are going into further detail, or you'd like to bring these presentations in-house or customize them for your institution, we're happy to do that. Reach out, and if there's anything we can expand on for you, we would be glad to. So that being said, let's move this along. All right, so we're going to start today by looking at those risk evaluation tools, and we're going to repeat a slide that we had in our first presentation. And we're going to look at these different screening tools from the very most basic all the way up through the more intrusive. If you look at the 4 that, or the 5 that we begin with: questionnaire, database, Rsra, transaction screen, phase 1. Those are all reconnaissance. They're research. They're just looking at documentation that's been provided and incorporating observations. They don't involve any sampling. They don't involve the collection of any materials. They don't involve any laboratory data. What they might involve is review of previous investigations, but they are not active, intrusive investigations themselves. The phase 2 is the only one that is intrusive and requires actual sampling and follows a very specific scope. So we're going to go back to the beginning and talk about questionnaires, which are, again, like we said, the most basic. I'm sure many of you see questionnaires. You may use questionnaires as your preliminary screening tools. You may use them as part of your loan documentation. They're used in many different ways, and they can be very useful. At the same time, though, we'll talk a little bit about considerations with questionnaires when we get to the following slides. The database report is the next level of screening that is used, and this looks only into the listings that are on record with regulatory agencies. So just because there aren't listings in a database report, it doesn't mean there aren't problems. And we recently actually had a client ask us, I have an old phase 1 and I did a database report, and the database report didn't find anything, but this phase 1 actually was brought to us, and it had some historical information in it that identified a concern. Why didn't that come up in the database report? Well, because the potential concerns were found actually through the historical research and through historical sources. So aerial photographs, city directories, fire insurance maps, those don't get reported to the regulatory agencies, so you won't see those in a database report. The database report is really meant to do a screening for what has been reported, so you have a quick litmus test of, is there a regulatory issue that's been reported and needs managing right now, or has been managed in the past, that won't tell you about something that hasn't been discovered yet. So just a really quick distinction and something important. Database reports are very useful, though, for doing some pre-screens on transactions. We see a lot of our clients use our pre-screening tool to look at, are there listings on the subject or in the surrounding area that they should be concerned about before they embark on their due diligence mission. So there's a lot of really useful and low cost utility for a database report. The next level up is that Rsra, the Record Search with Risk Assessment, coined by the SBA. It is an investigation that's actually used quite often, not just for SBA loans, but beyond SBA loans, because it's been proven to be a really useful tool. And it takes all these desktop sources, database reports, historical records, questionnaire, and it compiles them into one report. And so you'll get a snapshot of your property's history, as well as the regulatory insight and any feedback that may come from the current owner operator or previous owner through the questionnaire. And that's another low cost desktop style report that doesn't require any field investigation and normally can get turned around in short order. Most vendors turn them around in about 5 business days. Some a little bit more. You can always rush information. So if you want to pay a premium, you can get that, but get that sooner. But it is a quick turn, and it is a good amount of data for what you're paying for. The next level up from there is a transaction screen, and the transaction screen and the phase 1, I should say, both incorporate a site visit at the property. So you don't actually, and I should clarify that the transaction screen doesn't necessarily require the EP to visit the site, but it does incorporate a site visit. The phase 1 does require an EP site visit. So what we have here is the transaction screen looking at the subject property primarily. And we just noted again that just a few weeks ago, the ASTM released the up-to-date standard for the ASTM 1528. So that's now the 22. It's no longer the 14. So as you engage vendors, if you use the transaction screen, you may want to consider moving on up to the next level that's recently been released through the ASTM standards. But as you'll see, each one of these adds on another component. So we have a site visit. And the phase 1 takes it a little bit farther, and it includes an in-depth regulatory file review. So what you have here is constantly building on top of each previous iteration to expand and include more information. The phase 1 ESA is the only one that will qualify for the innocent landowner defense, but I have to caveat that just getting a phase 1 alone doesn't necessarily protect you unless you follow through on recommendations from the environmental professional. So you can document the conditions before you took title to a property, but you also want to make sure that if your borrower is taking title, or you're looking to foreclose, that you understand what you're going to be responsible for before you take title. And then the phase 2 ESA is a very site-specific, actually a very issue-specific investigation. It includes the sample collection, so you could do soil, groundwater, air, even, but it is an intrusive investigation, and it usually incorporates laboratory analysis, so you get results back and compare them against regulatory standards. It's important to note about the phase 2 ESA, if we were to use an analogy. I've heard borrowers come to me and say, well, why don't you just do a phase 2 already? It's a gas station, and I know you're going to want it. So just skip everything else and do a phase 2. But you don't go to surgery for no reason. You don't say, hey, doc, I want to go have an operation. Let's open me up, okay? Because the doctor's going to say, whoa. Before we open you up, let's take a look at why we would do that. So if you think about the iteration of medical visits that you'd have to do, you'd have to go to your primary and see what's going on. What is the basic underlying issues? What are your symptoms? What might we be looking at? And then look at your family's history and look at what your risk factors are, so that they could build a profile and understand what the problem is and what they need to look into. It's the same thing for a phase 2. you need to do the previous levels of investigation to understand what the scope is that you're looking at. It could be a gas station today, yes, and it might have been a gas station 50 years ago, but if we're doing a phase 2 and we're only looking at the current location of the tanks, but 30 years ago the site was redeveloped and reconfigured, there may be a different location, former tank grave, that hasn't been investigated that you should be looking at as well. So you really want to take into consideration why you're doing it, what you're doing it for, what you're testing for, and understand the scope of work that you want. So this is by no means an exhaustive list of common issues or contaminants, but these are some very common contaminants and some common issues that you will see paired together as you do your reviews. And it's handy to have nearby, but like I said, this is kind of just scratching the surface. This is not all that you'll see, but this is probably a fair amount of what might cross your desks. So I would say it's a handy chart to keep on hand. And as you're thinking about phase 2 scopes of work, or if you receive a phase 2 and you're curious about what they looked at or why, you can also cross-reference with this to see if it seems to make sense.
And Dario might add on to this is PFAS. Just recently, actually last week, the EPA is now proposing to designate 2 of the PFAS chemicals as a hazardous substance under the CREtelligent Act. This is going to have carry-on effect down to states, counties, cities, which will likely start requiring permitting and tracking of these 2 specific PFAS substances, which will carry on to the consultants. Internally, we're starting to consider writing it up and recognizing sites that would potentially have these chemicals as recognized environmental conditions.
Thanks, Lucy. Yeah, that's a great point. On Friday, I think it was, the EPA issued the proposed rule. So I'll be curious to see how that plays out. Definitely PFAS is an emerging topic, but it's not that it hasn't been there. It's just that now there's a whole lot more attention being paid to it. And we're beginning to understand just exactly how bad the effects have been. So thank you for pointing that out. And if you're curious or you want any updates on that, by all means, folks, feel free to reach out to us along the way, and we'll be happy to update you for whatever we may hear as well. So understanding the tools you have and the common issues that are generally associated with certain property uses, you can start looking at your risk analysis considerations. And I like to think of this always as past, present, and future. So was there a risk at a property? Is there a risk at a property? Will there be a risk at a property? I avoided saying could, because there always could be a risk at a property. Somebody always could crash their semi, truck of 55-gallon drums of perchloroethylene on your property, and then you have a disaster. That always could happen. But I want to look at what most likely would happen, or is possible. So will there be a high risk property use in the future? Do you know that your borrower is buying a property and changing the use? There may not be an issue on the property as it stands today, but in the future there may be. Or it may be in the reverse, where you have an industrial property and they are changing the property use to residential. Then all of a sudden you have a new set of standards that apply to your property that are a lot more restrictive than previous for an industrial property. So there's a higher risk of human exposure and effects to human health and the environment. So bearing that in mind, the past, present, and future, and keep that in your mind as you do your reviews, because that's going to be important as you do things like try to reach your goal of quantifying your risk. So if we think about the steps and the journey that you go on, you want to identify your correct tool. And that tool is going to be dependent upon what your policy requires. So if we harken back to our previous presentation 2 weeks ago, what did you build into your policy matrix? Where is your risk tolerance? What is important to you for evaluating risk? So once you've established your matrix and you identify that correct tool, you want to obtain reliable information. So you want to go to sources that you know you can trust, and that will give you information that's going to be helpful for you, that is consistent. Identify the threats to your collateral. They could be on-site threats, but they could also come from the surrounding area. So identify your threats and understand them. Identify any additional information that you may need so that ultimately you can quantify that risk and make an informed decision. So if we think about the risk analysis, how many of you have seen a questionnaire? And I wish I could see you raise your hands, but I'm going to imagine everybody's raising their hand saying, oh, we have something like that. How many times have you seen a questionnaire come across your desk? And it probably looks like this. It could be in the ASTM format. There's usually yes, no, you're asking for some information. Was there ever a high risk industry on site? And you get all no's. And then you see pictures that accompany your property that look like this. Now, sure, on the bottom right, we have a Chinese food restaurant. And it was really nice of them to build a canopy so that you don't get wet when you run inside to get your takeout. But this site configuration also is really similar to a gas station and C-store setup. Possibly even if you look at the bay doors, there could have been bay doors here looking at the shapes of these windows. On the top left, this is not just a health food store. I mean, it would be great if it were, but we also find that we have a dry cleaner. And looking again at your site configuration, you see that there looks like there's pump islands that have been associated with this property. So you have to ask yourself, does everything add up? I'm sure we could sit here for hours and trade stories about what we've seen. I know I'm not the only one. So when you're evaluating your questionnaire, it's really important to
I think we have Gary is frozen here for a second, folks. Just give her a second here. Looks like she may have lost internet. Lucy, are you on okay? There we go.
Which is maybe just a few days before closing. Was it prepared by the current owner? Are they refinancing, or is the current owner a seller? The seller's interest in the transaction is different than a purchaser's interest in a transaction. So the seller doesn't want to have a hiccup in the transaction, and they want things to move along pretty smoothly. A prospective purchaser is likely going to be a little more conservative or concerned about what's happening. So, but they may not also be the best person with the most knowledge about the property. So understand who's filled out that questionnaire and be prepared to ask more questions if something doesn't seem to add up. Most people will be fairly honest, but it has happened when there's money on the table that folks are trying to move things along. And so it is our job as risk managers to assume the worst. And so if you assume the worst, then you can be prepared for it. So understand who completed your document. Do you have signatures? Was it the right person with the most knowledge about the property, or was it somebody who had just enough? If it was completed by a broker, are they the best person to fill it out? I would say probably not. They may be representing the seller, or the buyer, but they may not have the most knowledge about the property. So just remember that just getting a questionnaire to check a box and put it in the file isn't necessarily the best course of action, depending on who's completed it. Were complete answers provided? So you may have a lot of yes and no's and one word answers, but if they say that they had a previous investigation and they say yes, but they don't provide any additional information about that or a copy of that investigation, you're going to want to follow up. If it was all check marks and you had some narrative questions and the narrative questions were completed, follow up. You want to make sure you have as much information about that property as possible. Did the questionnaire give you an adequate understanding of the past, present, or future property uses? Did you have follow-up documentation that's been noted but you didn't receive? Were the photographs of the property consistent with the answers on the questionnaire? Were you missing signatures, or were there any other unresolved red flags that just left you scratching your head going, I really just I don't think I have enough here? If that's where you stand, then you need to get more. And if you can't get more, then you're going to need to move to the next level of investigation. Now, a database report cannot substitute for a questionnaire. This is a completely different screening tool. This is, like I said, pulling information on incidents that have been reported to regulatory agencies related to environmental health, environmental safety, compliance issues, that would be of note. And so most database reports have a full listing of what's been searched in the appendices. They'll tell you what all the databases are, where the information comes from, but ultimately it comes down to you to decipher that information. And there's a lot of tools that are out there. We have a pre-screen tool that has an algorithm built into it. You can also get a report that has no ratings, no algorithm applied, just pure data. It's really difficult if you don't have staff to sometimes sort through that. But on the same token, there are times where your database report will kick information over to you that's really difficult to interpret. And so if we remember back from our first presentation, if you don't feel like you can interpret that information well enough, if you feel like it's a little too much or you don't have a good enough grasp, then depending on who you're with, there are expectations that you have subject matter knowledge. And if you don't have it, you need to get it. So you may need to contract externally or use an attorney or use a consultant, but you have to be able to understand what it is you're looking at. A lot of database reports are filled with a lot of jargon, a lot of technical information. And sometimes they even include links. And if you can get to where you need to go through those links, that's fantastic, but it might lead you to a remedial action plan that once you open it up, you notice there's 24 areas of concern on a site, and then that gets really overwhelming. So understanding just how far you can go before you need to get additional support. So when you're doing your review of a database report, and on the right you'll see another flavor of database report, it's important to look at your subject property and your offsite properties. So looking at your subject property, are there listings on your property? Are they permit related? Is it from an incident? Is it from a violation? Are there open cases versus closed cases? Even if the case is closed, it still is important to follow up for additional information. So if you notice that a site has had an incident and your policy doesn't necessarily require additional work, it is good to get those additional documents. Although if there's been an incident on site, you'll have to ask yourself, what was the former property use and what led to that incident to have a release that required regulatory involvement? So did you already have knowledge of the listing? So if you're doing portfolio monitoring, for instance, you run database reports and get your feedback on the properties. If you already know about the incidents and there aren't any new incidents, then you can take that into mind. You can put that into your risk analysis. But if there are new listings that have occurred that you weren't familiar with from before, that's something you're going to want to dig into a little bit more. Merely holding a permit on a property isn't necessarily an environmental issue, but it can lead to an issue if it's a permit for handling hazardous materials or generating hazardous waste. Then there's an increased risk at your property that something can be mishandled and result in an incident. Even for the best managed properties, it is impossible to avoid accidents. They happen. So understanding what is in there and what are the nature of your listings. And do you have any documentation resolving any of those listings that may be of concern to you? When you're looking at your offsite properties, it's very similar: permit, incident, violation, open versus closed. But you also have to start considering the proximity to your property. Can an offsite property be presenting a risk to your subject property? Or do you feel like it's far enough away that it's reasonable enough to understand that the plume wouldn't generally have migrated that far? Some database reports will incorporate the entire area of footprint or area of a Superfund site. So you might see that your subject property is located within an area that's been affected by a Superfund property. Your property may or may not be in one of the operable units, but it might just be generally in the area. It's important to ask more questions and understand why. Is it more of a neighborhood issue? Is it a nearby property? Is it an adjacent property? And what's that level of threat? What is your risk tolerance? remember in our last presentation, we were talking about establishing just how much are you willing to accept? When is it too much? And so if you're willing to accept that, a quarter mile away, there was a leaking underground storage tank and the case is closed, and you don't feel like you need to look into it more, then that's great. You document that. Document your rationale. Why is it that way? Support yourself with facts. The Rsra, and you're going to start to see some common themes now in the approach to evaluating your risk. So when you get to your Rsra, this is one of those printed reports, a desktop report, and it involves an opinion. Look at your findings. Are the findings in the report supported by research? Are they able to reference the sources? Or are there claims made without credible references? Look at your conclusions. Are the conclusions supported by the findings? And are you able to reference support for those conclusions? Do the recommendations give clear next steps? Do they make sense? If 1 and 1 isn't equaling 2, then you need to stop and look at where is your gap. Is it less than a year old? For the SBA, they would expect an Rsra to be less than a year old, and the SBA also expects that data gaps in that Rsra be explained. So if there were any gaps in information, have they been adequately explained? Has it been explained on whether or not it affects the findings of that report? If that data gap has an effect on the findings, and there's a caveat placed on those findings, then you're going to want to make sure that you answer that question so that you can properly inform yourself and understand your risk. Are there risks to the subject property, and are there risks to your subject property from your offsite? And you'll see that these just continue to repeat over the next few iterations of reports. So transaction screens and phase 1s, very similar. You want to see that those findings are supported by sound research, and that the vendor that's prepared the report can reference the sources where they found that information. Just as much as if they are making a claim that there's an issue, you want to know that they have the documentation to show where that issue was identified. But at the same time, if the issue's been resolved, you can't just accept, but it's not a problem anymore, it received a no further action letter, if you don't have the no further action letter in hand. Because remember, in our last presentation, no further action letters come with a lot of caveats, and unless you understand the conditions of that closure, you'll have a difficult time understanding whether or not it continues to present a risk. So are those conclusions supported by the findings? If they found that there's evidence of former underground storage tanks on site, but then their conclusion is you don't need to do anything further, the site is low risk, does that add up? Did you get enough information to tell you why those underground storage tanks aren't an issue? And I'll tell you, I've been guilty of it myself. You're an EP, you're in the field, you've reviewed volumes of information, you've determined that a site isn't an issue, and you write it up, and then you have the client come back and say, okay, well, you said it's not an issue, but I don't understand why. You need a little bit more. You need to make sure that your vendor leads you to the water, helps you understand how you got from point A to point B. They don't need to tell you their full analysis, but at least enough to help you understand how they reached that conclusion. They can't just say, this is here, but it's not a problem, don't worry. Not enough. And are the recommendations appropriate for the conclusions? I'll share a brief story that I received a phase 1 years ago when I was at SunTrust. And it was a report on a property that was a residence, but it was converted into an office. And the recommendations were that a phase 2 be performed because it was a former residence and might have had an underground storage tank. The site was currently serviced by natural gas. And so my question back to the vendor was, did you research the connection date to natural gas? What makes you think, did you see evidence of an underground storage tank? I need to understand more about why this is being raised as an issue if you didn't observe any evidence of it in the field or in the building department records or in any of your research. This just kind of hit me out of the blue. Oh, but there might have been a UST. So I asked them to please go back and look at the date of connection. And the date of connection to natural gas coincided with the date of construction for the structure. And so I asked them to please take that into consideration in their conclusions and their recommendations. And they were able to reissue the report without recommending a phase 2 to look into a UST that may or may not have been there when there was no reason to believe that it was in the first place. So do those recommendations make sense? Just as easily, you can have a recommendation to do nothing when you feel like maybe something more is required. And this comes down again to your risk tolerance. You really need to understand where you stand on those issues. If you need additional investigation, that's what your institution needs. Your money's going out the door to the client. So before your money goes out the door, you have to be satisfied with why. Have there been any data gaps in that report? Again, have they been adequately explained? Do you feel like the report isn't complete, or they can't get a good opinion from the EP if you don't have that information? If that's the case, you need to fill that gap. It needs to be able to be closed so that you don't have any outstanding information that could make your property quickly go from no risk to excessive risk. Are there risks to the subject property from on-site sources or again from off-site sources? And were there any oversights? I would advise that you check your appendices, cross-reference the information, takes a quick, just a quick look in the back to look at photographs, to look at the database report, look at a previous report, and skim through that. Does the information appear to be consistent in translation? It happens. Typographical errors happen, oversights happen. You want to make sure that hasn't been missed. So I would advise that you do take a quick look at your appendices and cross-reference with the different sections to make sure that the information is consistent. And then finally, just some general report considerations. Did the report meet the standard listed? So again, I would advise it's great to receive a report. It says it's a phase 1. They say this is 152713 phase 1. High five, we did it. But just calling it a 152713 phase 1 doesn't make it a 152713 phase 1. If they don't even discuss data gaps, then immediately you don't have a compliant report. If they leave things out, you need to understand your standard so that you understand what should be in that report, so that you know whether or not that report is going to be sufficient for what you're expecting. Especially if you're looking at a pre-foreclosure, you cannot have any errors in that report that could lead to you forfeiting an AAI. And as a secured creditor, like we discussed again, secured creditor, you do have a safe harbor, but you always want to make sure that you're not leaving any gaps, any technicalities that can get you on the hook. Is the report still current? So for a phase 1 ESA, the report is actually considered current only within 180 days of the site visit, not the date on the cover of the report. So the date on the cover of the report is really merely just a reference, but the site visit probably occurred a few days or hopefully, a week or two before that cover date. You want to understand, is your report still valid? Are there any limitations in the report that might be hidden or may not be outwardly obvious to you? One common one is to see that a vendor has limited their liability to the value of the report. Well, if you paid $1,900 for a report, but you end up having a $200,000 problem, and you accepted those terms and conditions in your contract with the vendor, and they've limited their liability to $1,900, it's going to take an awful lot of money with lawyers to figure out and get what you need to offset your risk. So you don't want to find yourself trapped with limitations that you did not want to accept in the beginning. So really watch that language. If you do have a master services agreement with a vendor, make sure that your master services agreements are very clear on what your expectations are on limitations of liability. And if there's any language in their reports that come through, because a lot of these are boilerplate, and unless you catch it and say, hey, this needs to be updated to be consistent with our MSA, it may just default to limiting liability to the value of the report. You want to make sure you don't find yourself in that situation. So as you're looking through your transaction screen, your phase 1, or even a phase 2, really make sure that you're understanding what those potential risks could be. Phase 2, how are we doing on time? Oh, I got 10 minutes. All right, see what we can do, Gary.
Good
Phase
stuff.
2. I'm trying to keep myself in check, people. All right, so this is a little different. The phase 2 risk analysis. Want to look at your scope. Was the scope requested? Was it followed? Did you outline the scope that needed to be followed? If there were any gaps or any non-conformance with the scope that you requested or with the scope that was listed, why did that happen? Now, these things occur, you know, there are boulders under the ground and geoprobes can't always go through them. From New England, and I can't tell you how many times we'd have to shift a boring location or just eliminate a boring altogether because we couldn't get through a boulder with our hollow stem augers. It just happens. So we want to understand if the scope changed, why did it change? What was found at the property? So think about this in the context of, say you have, you know, an issue in your house and you got to call a professional to come out. You want to know, what did you find? Where did you find it? And how much is it going to cost me to fix? Well, it's no different with a phase 2. What was found? Where was it found? How much was found? And what is it going to cost? If the vendor can't provide estimated remedial cost on that first round of investigation, they may have to go back and do another round. They might have to do 3 more rounds to understand the full extent. Hopefully, if they have to do 3 more rounds of investigation, you'll know by that point, maybe this isn't quite the piece of collateral that you hoped it would be. But your risk tolerance may be like, hey, let's do this. So you just need to understand that you're not always going to hit it on the first time. But usually you can get a pretty good idea for the order of magnitude of the impact at a property, and at least understand what your next steps could be. One thing that I would caution against is there a potential for migration off of your subject property onto another property? So can your property have an issue that's impacting the properties around it? I would tell you that once you find yourself in a situation where that may be the case, you could be opening up potential for third-party claims. Or maybe not you, but there is a potential for third-party claims. And third-party claims, what the heck are those? Well, if the subject property is impacting other properties, those property owners can sue and say, hey, you know, sue for diminution of property value or sue because there's a health impact. So migration offsite, if a plume cannot be controlled, if you can't stop it from migrating offsite or impacting surrounding properties, then there's always a potential that there's going to be exposure to potential lawsuits, and you can't control who's going to sue you for how much. So please understand that as you're reviewing a phase 2, look at your plume, look at the boundaries of the plume, look at your direction of groundwater flow, and understand where it is relative to the properties around it. And just like with any other report, check your appendices. It is not uncommon to have a decimal place in the wrong location. So you may be looking at your report and look at the lab data and realize that a decimal place was misplaced inside the report. You want to make sure that the concentrations that are being reported back to you are reflected correctly. Just as easily, it may say, you may see the report say that concentrations in bold and red exceed a regulatory standard, but you're looking at the number and you see the standard is 2, but the concentration that was detected is 1, and you can't understand why it was bold and red. You're probably looking at a typographical error. Contact your vendor, talk to them about it, and understand what could be the nature of that. It's really important, though, to understand and verify the work that's coming back to you. Documentation, 6 minutes. All right, we're in the home stretch, folks. So documenting your findings for your loan file. Did you follow your policy? Were the tools that you used consistent with your policy matrix? Or if they weren't, did they give sufficient information and explain why? Was the risk evaluated? So were those potential environmental risks evaluated and identified? And how did you do that? And then is your risk quantified and understood so you can make an informed decision? Remember your regulator, and I can't even list all that are out there right now, but remember that your regulator and remember what their requirements are. You have the table from the first presentation. Understand what they're looking for. If you can't answer these questions concisely and you find yourself scratching your head, then you may need to go back and look at what is happening at the collateral. It's really important to communicate clearly So when you put together your documentation for your file, focus on clarity, be concise, avoid that copy and paste. I know it's so tempting to go into that PDF file, copy those phase 1 findings, put that in your memo and say, we're done. But the reality is that for just as difficult as it may be for you to decipher that, it's going to be even more difficult for your credit officer to decipher it. It's going to be difficult for the borrower to decipher it, your account officer. So try to distill that information into very clear issues. If you have a whole paragraph of issues and someone has to dig to find them, you may not be documenting your file adequately, and you may find that you missed something as a result of that. Compliance. So did the document comply with your policy matrix? Did the document follow the appropriate scope? And does the collateral meet your criteria for acceptability? And that's again based on your risk tolerance. If you look at your analysis, list the primary risks identified and whether or not those risks have been sufficiently mitigated. Why? How? Are they a risk to your subject property? Is your subject property a risk to offsite properties? For your unmitigated risks, indicate whether or not you've been able to sufficiently quantify the potential risk. And if you haven't, then you look at your conditions precedent. So prior to closing, what are the steps that need to be followed? Be clear. Your clients, your borrowers are going to come to you and they're not going to understand most of what you tell them. So you have to be simple. You have to be clear so they can get you what you need. If you make exceptions to your policy, identify the mitigating factors that offset your risk and make sure you cite documentation that supports your decision. Just saying that the borrower told me that there's nothing on the property isn't enough. You have to have something credible to back up your decision. And it could be any number of documents, any number of pieces of information, but it needs to be something that you can point back to that will be reliable and consistent and can support why you made the decision you made. It could be numbers. It could be that the borrower has a letter of credit from a different institution. It could be that the seller is putting up an escrow. Whatever it is that is mitigating your risk, document it with facts and figures. Bring it all together. I've got 3 minutes. Okay, folks, know your regulator, know their expectations, define your risk tolerance and manage your program through your policy and your matrix. Identify, quantify, and mitigate your risk in that order. Remember, you don't just go to the doctor for surgery before you've gone through all the other steps that lead up to it. If you're issuing waivers or exceptions, document that rationale and document the supporting information that helps you lead to that decision. Train your staff, your review staff, train your field staff, train your clients, train your vendors, train on your program. Make sure that your internal business partners, your business development officers understand what the requirements and expectations are for your program so that they can have a meaningful conversation with the client so that you can get the information that you need efficiently. And be consistent. If anything, and I have to say, I was told that my Yoda quote last week was inaccurate. He actually said it to Anakin Skywalker and not to Luke. My apologies. The rest of the quote was on point. But be consistent. You don't want to undermine your credibility. So the more you waive, the more you make exceptions, the more you have to think about your policy and why you have to make so many exceptions. So that brings our presentation and our webinar series to a close. If you're looking for more information about CREtelligent, we offer a whole slew of services. We don't just focus on environmental, and you can reach us at our website, or you can order any of our products that are available through Radius. We have our suite of environmental investigations, but we also have land services, including ALTA surveys, zoning reports. We've got our pre-screen reports, including our property condition pre-screen. We do PCAs. We have some really interesting property resilience reports. We have the carbon footprint report. We have a climate check report, your flood zone. These all incorporate some really interesting information. A lot of these are fairly low cost and available almost instantaneously. So feel free to peruse our website, or if you want to access Radius, it doesn't require a specific login. You can go to Radius and set up your login and order reports through Radius. I'm going to stop here and see if there's been any questions.
Thanks, Daria. Very thorough and a lot of great information. We have a couple of questions that came in. We're right at the allotted time now, but we'll see. There was one point of clarity on the transaction screen that came in earlier. It doesn't necessarily have to be conducted by an EP, but the bank can contract for that, and that the SBA kind of conflicts with that, and it does require an EP. And so thank you. I think that came in from Georgina Bannett, who was actually on the subcommittee that worked on the transaction screen change, I believe. There was one other on desktop reports around, we're a small bank, we don't have environmental expertise. Can I get a review on a simple desktop screen? And yes. I would imagine an opinion is what they're looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's not an uncommon thing to ask for. We have that in our Pro Insight series, so we can get an EP to look at something really quickly and give a quick opinion. That is not an uncommon request at all. So most definitely.
Great. And there was one other that might be a little bit too big for us to crack on this session, but it was around the whole appraisal process and the fact that there's a questionnaire on the appraisal form that asks if there's any evidence of environmental contamination. That is generally checked no or somewhat overlooked. What do you do in a case where you're kind of conflicting information?
Talking about a can of worms here, but let's see if I can answer this really quickly. Okay, so if an appraiser checks a box or says that they've viewed contamination or seen contamination on a property, and I had this come up actually on a property where an appraiser made the extraordinary assumption that there was no contamination on site, which was fantastic. And then in the appraisal photographs, he took a picture and he labeled it soil contamination. And so then immediately that made his value hypothetical, because if you have contamination on site, you cannot have your value becomes hypothetical. You can't land on a hypothetical value. So then we immediately had to address it. So most appraisers will make an extraordinary assumption that there is no contamination on site. So that way it doesn't hinder their value. It doesn't make it a hypothetical value. And instead that can be managed through the environmental risk process. So that, in a real nutshell, and very short, because this is a subject that we could talk about for hours, is the short answer to that. So if an appraiser notes contamination on site, that's a hypothetical value and can't be lent on a hypothetical value.
Perfect. Yeah, I know it's quite a complex topic, and hopefully maybe the appraisal subcommittee will tackle it. But no, that's great. I think we're at the allotted time now. Again, Daria, thank you very much for an informative 45 minutes. In fact, thank you for, I think if I calculate right over the 3 sessions, about 145 minutes worth of good content. So thank you very much for that. And thank you all for attending. I hope you attended all 3 sessions. If not, a reminder, we're going to be sending out all the materials for all 3 sessions in the next couple of days. So be looking for that. And with that, I think we'll close things out. Be looking for future webinars that we'll be hosting. And with that, everybody have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary.